If for no other reason than for its size, Brazil deserves special attention. It's the 5th largest country on Earth. I believe it's close to that in population, if not larger than 5th. The mouth of the Amazon River alone is as large as all of Belgium. And actually, if Brazil were as densely populated as Belgium is, everybody on Earth would live in Brazil. So because of its size, it's an extremely important country, but it is for other reasons as well. Certainly the Amazon River region is important. 25% of the world's trees are there. And whether or not the Amazon is developed, how the Amazon is developed, is of great interest to all of us, because what happens to the Amazon ecosystem may well affect all living creatures. Brazil's population ranges from blue-eyed blonde to darkest black, with everything in between. It's as racially diverse a country as there is in the world, and considering its racial diversity, has probably had as harmonious a kind of racial relations as any country in the world. On the economic side, Brazil was for many years the largest debtor nation, but now, like Avis, they're number 2 and we're number 1. So what do we conjure up when we conjure up images of Brazil? Rubber and coffee plantations, the jungle, the strikingly modern city of Brasilia, and perhaps the girl from Ipanema, depending on your taste. His Excellency Sergio Correa de Costa is Brazil's ambassador to the United States, and he is our guest, of course, tonight. He is a career diplomat with a multifaceted record of service to his country, as well as long experience in our country, although he was only posted as ambassador to Washington in 1983. He graduated from the National Faculty of Law of the University of Brazil and did postgraduate studies in economics, economic geography, and history at the University of California, Los Angeles. In the early years of his career, he was secretary of the Brazilian embassies in Buenos Aires and in Washington, and later was a Brazilian consul in Los Angeles. He was acting head of the Brazilian delegation to the Organization of American States in 1947 and 1948, and later was posted to the Rome embassy. He served from 1962 to 1966 as ambassador to Canada, and in 1967 he headed Brazil's delegation to the Geneva Disarmament Conference. From 1968 to 75, he served as ambassador to Great Britain, and next as permanent representative from Brazil to the United Nations. Finally, as I said, in 1983, he presented his credentials as Brazil's ambassador to the United States. He is widely published, being the author of several books and numerous articles, and has been decorated for distinction by 19 nations. So we are very honored tonight to have such a distinguished representative from his country to speak to us, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you now, His Excellency Sergio Correa de Costa.
Thank you, Sheila, for a most gracious introduction. I trust you were all impressed by it. My secretary, who supplied the ammunition, assured me that you would, and she never fails. Dr. Bird gave me some information about you, about the audience, what to expect, told me how inquisitive you are. Beware of the question and answer period, which made me a bit edgy, but I believe that this is going to be the most, if any, exciting part of this presentation. He also mentioned about the time length, and for your comfort, I'll tell you that I'm very disciplined as far as time goes, and will never forget that the first time I came to the United States, the American counselor in Brazil gave me a bit of advice which has been invaluable throughout my life. He said, when you go and address an American audience, please be explicit as to the time you're going to spend for the length of your statement. Because, he said, Americans can put up with anything, provided they know how long it's going to last. So perhaps whatever I will leave out of this presentation will come out during the question and answer period. Sheila gave you more or less the vital statistics of the country and touched upon a few interesting points which, like the Amazon ecosystem, etc., that maybe can be raised by some of you during the presentation. But I thought that perhaps instead of a panoramic view, as the title of this lecture implies, Foreign Relations of Brazil, which is something very, very vague, perhaps I ought to center my remarks on recent developments, let's say Brazil-United States relations. And I would start by saying, perhaps to the amazement of some of you, that in the year of grace of 1372, King Ferdinand of Portugal signed a treaty of alliance with the English, represented in the act by John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. It is the oldest international treaty still in force today. And you may very well ask, but why on earth such a treaty signed 615 years ago have anything to do with the theme that I'm proposing to address you at this moment? But let me remind you that this treaty of 1372 bound the United Kingdom very closely to the Kingdom of Portugal, not merely for years to come, but for centuries to come. And when the new continent was discovered, 100 years later, the Portuguese eventually settled in Brazil, as did the Pilgrims in North America. And as a consequence, a natural consequence, the two colonies became the natural allies in an otherwise hostile, aggressive, imperialistic Spanish world. We were the sole exceptions in that Spanish world. And that pact of alliance between our two mother countries not only drew us together, but gave us a common direction long before we ourselves became free nations, one as the Brazilian Empire and the other as the Republic of the United States of America. The Brazilians were the first to commend the Monroe Doctrine. The United States was the first country to recognize our independence, and our embassy in Washington, established in 1824, became Brazil's first permanent mission anywhere abroad. Thus, we are friends of long standing and ought to know each other well. But do we really? From the remote past, let us take a jump into the present and perhaps into the future. Centuries of close solidarity have not exhausted the novelty of the relationship and of its potential for success and risk, gain and loss. Somehow, this nation of yours is a very different country from what it was only 5 or 10 years ago, as stressed emphatically by Secretary of State Schultz in his Los Angeles address, October 1984, and he'd added, and I quote, "Our allies and our adversaries both know it," he said. And I must say that Brazil also is today quite a different country. The political opening that took place in the past year, the election of a civilian president, the deep transformations that have taken place over the last 2 decades are all likely to bring face to face 2 new realities, the American and the Brazilian. Our relations must be examined in the light of these new realities taking shape in our 2 countries. Since the United States' strategic interests as a great power encompass the entire world, it tends to fit its bilateral relations or its relations with groups of nations in the broader context of its global policy. And this inevitably involves political, ideological, and strategical considerations. For its part, Brazil is fast evolving into a modern and complex society whose interests also extend at varying degrees to several regions of the globe. Brazil, thus, had to adjust its foreign policy to this broader and diversified context. One must further take into account the fact that Brazil's development in the last decades occurred at a time when the international community was in the throes of profound political and economic changes. These factors have naturally led to a reevaluation and adjustment in Brazil's bilateral relations with its main partners. It is obvious that as Brazil accelerated its growth and greatly expanded its participation in the international economy, it had perforce to broaden its contacts with the rest of the world. Brazil is now the 8th largest economy in the West and the 10th worldwide. And Brazil had to diversify its markets along the lines of a more flexible, independent foreign policy. Areas of conflict have necessarily multiplied, particularly in regard to nations such as the United States, which play a dominant role in this scenario. And you'll remember it's been in the press widely our problems with steel, footwear, textiles, informatics, the problems we have facing each other in third markets, namely our policies on soybeans or exports of poultry. The U.S. believes that we are competing with them in certain areas, and this creates in the trade area a number of, let's say, irritants that we try to minimize and put into a more suitable context. Yet, I would say that the degree of maturity that characterizes relations between our 2 countries keeps existing difference from getting in the way of close cooperation in other areas. One should accept that priorities or the immediate interests of the 2 countries do not necessarily coincide. Such lack of symmetry is to be found in various fields. While the United States' topmost priority is external security, ours is definitely the matter of development. Since the American perspective is predominantly concerned with the strategic aspects of security and defense, the pivot of the United States foreign policy is, understandably, the USSR. Brazil's first priority, however, cannot possibly be the same. Although we fully share the West's democratic ideals, we simply cannot center our foreign policy on global security concepts. At this stage of its social and political evolution, Brazil's fundamental commitment, I repeat, cannot be other than the country's development. This, however, does not mean incompatibility. On the contrary, our two countries share basic affinities, political, economic, and cultural. The Brazilian people's attachment to democracy, to the freedom of expression, to market economy, to free trade, just to name a few, is a foundation significant enough for a mature relationship. Points of convergence as well as divergence are also to be found in the United States' relations with other countries of the hemisphere with which Brazil has close political and cultural links and endeavors to further intensify overall relations. Latin American countries, which are all undergoing profound social change, share aspirations and problems similar to those we experience in Brazil. In their relations with the United States and other developed nations, for that matter, understandably, their national interests often coincide more closely with other developing countries, non-regional developing countries like India, China, or Pakistan, than with those of the United States next door. Few countries today still admit that their own interests are necessarily those of Washington. Quite the opposite. Some are becoming increasingly convinced that the United States are antagonistic to their interests and to those of other developing nations. Both in Latin America and in the United States, there is a growing awareness that the era of unquestionable American control over the hemisphere has come to an end, as much as the notion of special relationship. Such realization strongly calls for a complete review of the regional picture. It seems that one of the main challenges to the American foreign policy in the years to come will be the protection of its essential interests in an era in which the presumption of hegemony will have given place to a presumption of conflict. Brazil and the majority of the Latin American countries no longer expect bilateral concessional assistance from the United States, but rather seek to ensure universal trade practices that would facilitate their access to industrialized markets. The issues today that are really crucial to Brazil and to Latin America as a whole tend to lead to a confrontation with the United States under the panoply of the new international economic order. Such problems, such as debt management, special drawing rights, transfer of technology, basic products, tariffs and countervailing duties, foreign capital, migrant labor, became paramount. And such array of problems has to do with the redistribution of resources, of income, of status, and ultimately of power. Although the United States can no longer presume that common interests will automatically link it to Brazil and to the other Latin American countries, neither of us should accept conflict as inevitable. A challenge before us should be the widening of areas of common interest. The cooperation in solving by peaceful means, and by peaceful means only, intra-hemispheric tensions whenever conciliation is feasible, and joint effort to alleviate the effects of conflicts when these become unavoidable. The attempts to remedy regional crises with palliative solutions that do not meet the interests of all concerned have only served to accentuate the region's political, social, and economic disparities. The redemocratization process that Brazil and other countries of the region are now experiencing has been taking place in the midst of the most serious economic crisis of the century. It seems clear to me, though, that the worsening of this critical juncture could have very negative, if not fatal, consequences to these emerging democratic regimes still in a fragile process of consolidation. The return to authoritarian regimes fostered by adverse economic conditions would result in a backslide of unforeseeable consequences and could turn the current redemocratization process into just one more cycle, democracy, authoritarianism in Latin America's turbulent history. For this reason, I find it important to stress that the simultaneous occurrence of a grave economic crisis and the vigorous effort at democratization in Latin America has brought about a convergence of interests among the various countries of the region, a convergence never before witnessed. It is to be hoped that the United States should not fail to grasp the meaning of the winds of change and reassess under a different light the nature of its links with the hemisphere, no longer resorting to a piecemeal approach to crisis, but conceiving a turnabout in policy capable of making it genuinely responsive to the emerging realities of the region. One can well understand the fact that the United States does not have, and may not even seek to have, a specific policy for Latin America once its concerns are basically global and thematic rather than regional. Whatever the United States does in Latin America is and will be a reflection of its global policies. It thus fails to take into full account our continent's peculiarities and interests. Relations can only be improved if they become less dictated by Pan-American rhetoric, the traditional bonds of friendship, than by the recognition of the stark realities around us. Sensible reasoning leads to the conclusion that it is definitely in the best interest of the United States to have Brazil and the other Latin American countries as sound partners, not antagonists in the face of the issues of the global agenda. I wonder what could be more important to the strategic and long-term security of the United States than a strong and democratic Latin America, developing at full speed and overcoming its deep-seated economic inequalities and social imbalances. Geography counts, or it should count. It does not change with time, with ideologies, or fashion. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, we certainly thank you for that comprehensive and challenging statement. If for some reason you have to leave before 10 minutes after 7, now would be a good time to depart. With that said, we'll begin our question and answer period.
I'm very flattered. I didn't see anybody move from the room. I think that's the greatest compliment.
Yes, sir. The question is, what was Brazil's policy with respect to the Malvinas crisis of a couple of years ago? What was the impact, do you think, of the position which the United States took at that time, the impact upon American relations with other countries in the hemisphere? And your other point? And the present relations between Brazil and Argentina. That's 3 of the 4.
Well, I was in New York as representative to the United Nations when the Falklands War took place. So I was privy to every detail of that evolution, and I'm glad you give me a chance to come back to that. And as it transpired in my statement, and at one point we say by peaceful means and by peaceful means alone, that implies that we did not approve, we did not support, we did not applaud in any way the military action as taken by the Argentinian government. What we stood by, and thus maintaining a position since 1833, when the English occupied the Falkland Islands, the Malvinas Islands, is to uphold the rights of the Argentinian to those islands. In 1833, Brazil set a protest, sent a protest to the English, and has been proclaiming steadily the right of the Argentinians to those islands. So, in a nutshell, we approved the right of the Argentinians, but we did not approve the use of the force. And with these two, it appears a nearly impossible situation. It was not impossible, but it was tight and difficult. And I was in the eye of the torment those days and had to leave every minute of this evolution. But we stood firm in this belief and worked for a peaceful settlement, and at many instances we are very close to a settlement which escaped us. And I believe that we won the recognition of the English and of the Argentinians for our standing in that portion. Of course, the position taken by the United States vis-à-vis the United Kingdom was caused a great deal of resentment in many Latin American countries. But it wasn't something that will stay forever. This is something that many tried and understood, that this is a NATO country, this is the mother country of the United States, so the special relationship counts, and the fact that it prevailed under the so-called special relationship that we have at the continent was a sore as you indicate, and your assumption is that it did not help the relationship the U.S. with the rest of Latin America, but I don't think that it caused a definitive damage to these relations, and they can recover from that. Yes, sir.
And I think there was also the question of the current relations between Brazil and Argentina.
I think I could say that they were never so good, and we had a dispute because of the big hydroelectric power project that we built in the Paraná River. You know, water is going to be, it is already, and for me it's going to be one of the most important problems in the coming years, because our planet has not enough water. Many countries are tremendously short of water. Any water development, hydroelectric in one country, international rivers, is bound to cause problems and oppositions in other countries. We have seen that, and we will see a lot more and in a lot uglier features in the coming years. And we try to find a reasonable solution for this Itaipu hydroelectric power, and the relationships improved to such a degree that the president of Alfonsine, just out of the blue in a meeting with the Brazilians, he decided to himself go and meet our president at the waterfalls, at the dam, which had caused so much strain in our relations in the past few years. And that the presence of President Alfonsine, besides the manner in which it was carried out, sort of sealed in a very visible way the strengthening and the solidarity that Brazil and Argentina carry this way, this moment.
We know that Brazil is, in addition to the fact that it has an enormous land area and the Amazon River, it's commonly known. We also know that Brazil is a highly industrialized country, probably the most industrialized in Latin America. Sao Paulo being an example. My question to you is this: with the dropping of oil prices and the necessity, of course, for oil to fuel its industrial economy, what chance do you think there is of your country servicing or repaying its foreign debt to the United States?
Well, normally one would have thought that a fall in the price of oil would be a blessing, an absolute blessing for Brazil, a country which imported 1 million barrels a day, the largest developing country importer of oil. And, but it is not so, because not only we have expanded enormously our own output from just 180,000 to 640,000, so over 60% of our needs are already produced locally, domestically, and a good part of the balance we found a substitute in ethanol as a fuel, not as a mixture, but as 100% fuel. And we're in the second or third generation of engines built to burn exclusively 100% ethanol. But it is a double-edged problem for us, because the cost of alcohol, which is fueling now 2.5 million cars in Brazil, and now the preference of the market is such that last year about 95% of the cars manufactured in Brazil, and we manufactured about a million cars, were exclusively alcohol. To get a gasoline car, very few people want it, and you have to wait months, and it's to be ordered specially to the factories. But if oil comes below the $20 mark, or much below the $20 market, we are in trouble with our alcohol, because the ethanol costs about that. So it is a relief. It is a relief, there's no doubt, on one side. We will spend perhaps $1 billion, $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion less in oil this year of '86. But on the other hand, the drought that we had in the south of Brazil is forcing us to import this year about 6.5 million tons of grains worth $1 billion, $1.5 billion. So this will offset immediately the gain with oil. And this is leading to the main thrust of your question, which is the foreign debt. And this is a question that applies or ought to be addressed not only to Brazil but to all debtor countries, mostly in Latin America, because the foreign debt is basically Latin American debt. Outside of Latin America, really, there are no main points of uncertainty or taking the slip of bankers in New York or elsewhere. But also the fall of price is, as you know, creating havoc in the economies of Mexico and Venezuela, and they may go into default. And the finance minister of Mexico has indicated that very clearly, that if there is this continual fall in prices, the demands of Mexico of new money may not be met by the banking community, and we may have a crisis which the finance minister of Mexico himself described when comparing with the 1982 default of Mexico as this being peanuts, or he used an image I don't remember, but the essence was this. You haven't seen anything if you're thinking of 1982. So these falls of prices will benefit somehow, but the crisis in Mexico, and if this leads to a strain in the international financial picture, this is going to affect those countries like Brazil, which are benefiting from the lower prices. We are inseparable. And out of the developing countries, or rather the debtor countries, should have said, Brazil is perhaps the better off in the sense that it is up to date in the interests. It's paying $1 billion every month, interest alone, meaning 11 billion, close to $12 billion a month. So every 3 or 4 years, we pay $30 billion, $40 billion, and still keep owing the 100. For the rest of our days, that's the rule of the game now. We'll pay about $50 billion in the coming 4 years. And at the end of these 4 years, we'll still be owing $100 billion. So it indicates that if we are after an answer, because it's not a question of just squeezing someone until he dies before settling his accounts, it shows that domestic adjustment alone is not enough. The prescriptions of the IMF have been followed by all these countries, debtor countries, and while the external environment is not organized, reorganized, I don't see a way out. Of course, we had the Baker Initiative. The Baker Initiative was a ray of hope. It's been criticized in this country and abroad, mostly unjustly, because it is not a finished program, a finished plan. It shouldn't be called a plan, it should be an initiative, but it is irrelevant. The Marshall Plan was a paragraph of a speech, and produced what we all know. So we cannot blame Secretary Baker for not producing a finished formula to settle and solve this problem, which looks intractable to most of us. But it is an initiative that ought to be perfected and amplified, and it reflects a wish to meet a situation that may get out of hand. Perhaps if the situation is worsened, then the Baker Initiative ought to be either strengthened or amplified or modified somehow to meet these expectations and these difficulties. As you see how complex what is, Mexico and Brazil are in trouble. Why we became in trouble? Because we didn't have oil, and we had to pay $5, $6, $7 billion a year in oil imports. And Mexico is in trouble because it had too much oil. So it looks like a contradiction, because the Mexicans having that much oil and believing that this could last forever and the prices would go or remain in the $30 or $40 level, sort of relied on it, while we, not having enough, having to pay hard cash every month for the oil bill, we increased dramatically our foreign debt. Our foreign debt is basically or largely the result of our oil bill. So we could no longer continue that way. We had to seek for alternative sources, which we successfully arranged. So that, as you see, it is a very wide, many-faceted aspects.
What do you see as the long-range process of democratization in your country?
The process of democratization, not only in Brazil, but in the other Latin American countries, and you all have seen that it is a vigorous upsurge of democracy, and military regimes are passed, and we have only 2 or 3 exceptions in the whole of South America, will depend on growth and development. If these countries continue applying only domestically these adjustment measures to produce enough to pay the foreign debt bill, this is leading to an untenable social situation in these countries. That's to say, no government is nowadays in a position to continue indefinitely. For some time, yes. For a few years, yes, and this has been the case. To reduce real wages in real terms, reduce consumption, force saving, control imports, force exports at any price to produce balances to pay the bankers, while large segments of the population are starving and near the subsistence level. No regime will ever be able to be maintained, a democratic regime will be able to be maintained. And so the only hope is that development can be made consistent with servicing of the debt, but servicing of the debt in different terms than the current ones, because the real interest rates that these countries are paying, despite the fact that rates have already peaked in 20% and have gone down so much, they are at the highest, still a very, very high level in historical terms. The whole development of the United States was made at rates of 2 and 3% historically. That was possible. The current rates are untenable for much, much longer. No country, and Brazil has been an exception, because Brazil perhaps has used wisely, or a bit more wisely than others, the borrowed money, except the part that was used as imports of oil. The fact that we can account for these, and these investments in infrastructure are now yielding the results. And for these reasons, after almost 4 years of recession and hunger and riots in the country and looting of supermarkets and the mothers being prosecuted and in jail for stealing bottles of milk, and the country in negative growth just to be punctual with this $1 billion a month. This was no longer maintainable, and in a reaction which was very healthy in the economy of last year, we reached 6.5% growth of GNP in real terms, which was the highest rate recorded last year. And we produced again $12 billion balance of trade by curtailing mostly imports and expanding our exports. So we could somehow, despite the soft point of the inflation, the unfinished or unsuccessful fight against the inflation, we could, with inflation, we could produce these results, this 12 billion net trade balance and the 6% growth. Therefore, we were able to produce 1.5 million or 1,600,000 new jobs, which is the minimum we need every year to, because of the population reaching working level. So this is a situation that has developed, and in short, and back to your question, I can only see the survival of democratic institutions if employment is being given and if growth, which is the natural aspiration of these countries, are provided, and they can only be provided by good governments, but good governments are not enough, an external environment that it is understanding of the situation and not suicidal.
From whom does Brazil buy its corn or grain?
I think that if I would make a trip to Kansas next week, I would be more applauded than Senator Dole, because we are planning to import the bulk of our requirements of milk. There's milk too. Milk was in the back of my mind. But corn and wheat from the United States.
Would you comment upon Brazil's policy toward Angola, especially with respect to, or taking into account, the apparent swing of the American government toward the support of UNITAS?
Well, Brazil was one of the first countries, perhaps the first country, to recognize the government of Angola when it was accepted and recognized by the United Nations in the fall of 1975. We didn't go into the domestic policies of Angola to see which of the group ought to be in power or not. The MPLA was the government in Luanda. It was recognized by the United Nations. That was enough for us. We didn't seek. There were other factions, the Savimbi faction, which is being supported by the United States, and Holden Roberto somewhere with other sponsors and patrons elsewhere. So we didn't go into that because we don't think that it is up to us to judge that. We're very close to Angola ethnically because we have the same culture, speak the same language, the same background, and Angola is closer to Rio de Janeiro by air than Brazilian cities of our far west, which some people do not realize how close Brazil is to Africa. And close, I don't mean geographically alone, because Brazil is the second African nation, because it has the largest black population after Nigeria. Therefore, we are an African nation as well, and we are across the ocean, and Africa in our textbooks, and I studied, my parents studied, the border of Brazil, we don't say it's our eastern border, we don't say the Atlantic Ocean, we say Africa. So we're that close. And we believe that we understand better Africa in general and Angola in general, Angola in particular, than other countries, including the United States. So I don't think that sharing or taking part in a civil war that is raging in one country is the proper way for outsiders, I mean, to take sides, and that is healthy or desirable, or it would pay in the long run. I don't think this is not the policy of Brazil, and we uphold the government as it is. The fact that the government of Angola being pressed, any government, any regime, it's a self-defense. The instinct of self-defense in the human being exists, and it exists in any regime. These former colonies, not having any help from the West, and Brazil is one to be blamed as well, because we did not side with the liberation movements early enough. We stood perhaps too long with the Portuguese government in maintaining those countries under colonial domination, knowing full well that it was simply a question of time. And the longer it would take, the worse, the greater the radicalization of positions. Where would these people turn to if they would not, if they were fighting Portugal, and how could they would accept support from any source? And they did accept, or they sought to obtain the support of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And once the government was inaugurated and being assaulted by the Savimbi forces, which is a domestic, it's a tribal, it's not a domestic, it is a tribal, it's a question of tribal rivalries of which we understand very little, and the US perhaps less. To be involved in these intimacies of tribal strifes in Africa. So they sought the help where they could get it. So they got the Cubans, and the Cubans were there. And what are the Cubans doing? They are maintaining the government, but they are also, and this is one of the contradictions of our world situation, they are also protecting the interests of the Gulf oil of Cabinda. Gulf oil, since the establishment of the Marxist government in November 1975, it's 10 years already, has not missed 1 month of dividends and profits. They are established there, they go in and out as a state, as the enclave of Cabinda, and they are protected by also the couple of Cuban regiments around that perimeter to prevent guerrillas or attacks which would disturb the normal pumping of this oil. There are several hundreds of $millions that Gulf collects punctually from, and so I'm convinced that if someone would go today to the board of Gulf and say, good news, the Cubans are leaving, the chairman would say, we cannot afford it. We cannot afford the departure of a platoon of Cubans. So it is a very complex situation. When one starts getting involved in other countries' strifes and party politics, we see how difficult it is to have a right position to take.
Would you comment on the government's policy, your government's policy, on the Amazon and balancing development and ecology?
We are more aware now, and we are to be blamed for, let's say, I wouldn't say crimes, but negligence, crime of negligence. And perhaps believing that the country is too big, the Amazon is so enormous, the population is inferior to that of the Sahara Desert, and that we would never be able to scratch these forests. But we are a good deal more conscious of that, and we have a Secretary of State for the conservation, for ecology. There's a national agency that establishes penalties for deforestation, and a policy of fiscal incentives for forestation. So any corporation or private individual with a forestation project can practically be financed by his tax. His tax, about 50% of his income tax, he can, if a project approved, apply in this. In the past, let's say 5 years, more trees are being planted than felled in the country. It is important, we know, but perhaps not enough. When we cut a 100-year-old tree and we plant a little plant, arithmetically, statistically, we didn't lose anything. But we know the extent of the loss.
You've been very direct with us and very complete in your answers, and we appreciate very much that, and you're spending so much time with us this evening.